Welcome to a Paparazzi Entertainment. Please subscribe to my channel.
The film opens in San Francisco, 1981. The main character of the film, Chris Gardner, sells a medical device for a living. As a daily routine, he drops off his son, Christopher, to a daycare and afterwards heads to various hospitals that might need what he's selling. As Chris narrates, the problem is that he needs to sell at least one device a month to get by, but almost every hospital sees the device as expensive and unnecessary. Because of this, he has to ask his wife, Linda, to pick up their son at the daycare. This is despite Linda working a double shift. That night, while having dinner, Chris sees a Rubik's Cube, which at that time is still a new toy. Linda asks him if he has already paid the taxes, and Chris tells her that he has to file another extension, making Linda more stressed before going back to work. After Linda leaves, Chris tries to solve the Rubik's Cube but finds it reasonably easy. The following day, while walking down the street, he sees a businessman with a nice car. Chris asks the man what he does for a living, and the man tells him that he's a stockbroker. After Chris comments that the job needs high education, the man responds by saying that it's not required because one only has to rely on his math and social skills. After the brief interaction, Chris narrates that people around him are so happy, asking why he couldn't be like that. The morning after, Chris tells Linda that he's going home at 6 because he will apply to be a stockbroker. Linda thinks it's ridiculous, which is something that Chris does not appreciate. They then argue, with Linda telling Chris that they have 2 months of rent to pay. Afterwards, Chris heads to a brokerage firm to apply. However, Chris leaves his medical device to a street performer because he does not want to go inside carrying it. Chris calls this part of his life being stupid. Sure enough, while he is applying for the job, he sees from behind the boss that the street performer is running away with the device, prompting Chris to quickly leave while carrying the application form. However, the street performer manages to get away via a train. The following day, Chris promises Linda that he will sell the device to not see it anymore. He then brings Christopher to the daycare, where Chris tells him that the word happiness does not have a Y in it, contrary to what is painted on the daycare walls. He then tells his son about his nickname, 10-Gallon Head, because he's from Texas, where they wear large cowboy hats. Afterwards, Chris heads to Dean Witter Reynolds with a filled-up application form, personally delivering it to Dean Witter's resource head, Jay Twistle. However, their interaction is brief because Jay is in a hurry. After dropping off the application form, Chris sees the street performer and her accomplice carrying the stolen device. Chris angrily chases them, narrating that he has spent his entire life savings on it, so losing one is worth a month's groceries. After chasing the two, he finally gets his device back. However, the problem is that he now has 2 devices, which is a far cry from his earlier promise that he's going to get rid of it. Later that day, sure enough, Linda sees the 2 devices and gets thoroughly disappointed. After giving their son a basketball for his birthday, Chris talks to Linda about what happened earlier. But Linda does not want to hear it. In the next scene, Chris talks to Jay while he's hailing a taxi. Chris tells him about the application form that he submitted a month ago, but Jay tells him he has to go somewhere. Chris then takes this as an opportunity to talk to Jay by telling him that he's going to the same place as Jay. Because of this, they both take the same taxi. Inside the taxi, Jay is focused on solving the Rubik's Cube while Chris is talking about his skills and personality. Noticing this, Chris asks to solve the cube, and Jay does not believe him. However, Chris finishes the cube just before Jay drops off, impressing Jay. However, he leaves Chris behind, which means that Chris has to pay the fare. Stopping at a stoplight, Chris makes a run for it and successfully escapes via a train, but he leaves behind his device after the train door closes on his hand. That day, Chris calls Linda to apologize for not being on time. Furious that she missed her shift, Linda tells Chris that she and Christopher are leaving. Sure enough, Chris goes home to find his wife and son gone. However, just then, he receives a call from Jay, telling him to write down his secretary's number so that they can talk tomorrow. Because there is no pen and paper nearby, Chris has to memorize the numbers and go to a nearby store to write it down on paper. The following day, Chris confronts Linda, who has just dropped off their son at the daycare. After Linda tells him that she's not happy anymore, Chris allows her to leave but that she can't take their son. Later that day, Chris brings his son home. That night, the landlord asks Chris for the rent, but Chris pleads with him to let him stay there for a while to pay him. The landlord agrees to let him stay for 10 days more. In addition, Chris will paint their rooms himself. The next day, while painting the walls white, a knock is heard at the door. Upon opening it, Chris sees 2 policemen who tell him to go with them to the station. Chris pays for the parking ticket at the police station, but the police officer tells him that it will be verified at 9:30 in the morning. Chris has no choice but to call Linda to take care of their son while he's gone for the day. Linda accepts, but on the condition that she's going to return their son late. Because of this, he stays at the station for the night. The following day, Chris runs for the interview at Dean Witter's. Because he has no time to change, he goes there still wearing his clothes from yesterday. There, Chris arrives, much to the noticeable disappointment of the panel. He then tells the panel, without sugarcoating it, that he got arrested yesterday for failing to pay parking tickets. As the interview progresses, the head, Mr. Frome, seems to be unimpressed with Chris. However, in the end, Chris manages to make the panel laugh. Afterwards, Jay congratulates Chris for successfully interviewing without wearing formal attire. However, Chris tells him that he'll think about the job because he learns that there is an intern period where he will not be paid at all. But Jay urges him to continue. After the interview, Chris heads straight to his house, waiting for his wife and son to arrive. Linda arrives with Christopher a little bit later. That night, while Christopher is asleep, Linda tells Chris that she's heading to New York to work as a waitress. Chris agrees, but only if their son stays with him. Linda believes that Chris can take care of their son, so she tearfully leaves them for good. The following day, the father and son move 2 blocks down to a nearby motel with the help of Chris' friend. Because it is Saturday, Chris invites his son to come play basketball. While shooting the ball, Christopher tells his father that he dreams of going pro. Chris, however, tells his son that he might not have a chance, so he should stop aiming for something like that. Chris then sees how his son's attitude changes. Seeing this effect of what he said to his son, Chris encourages his son not to let other people tell him that he can't do something, not even him. They then head to a hospital to sell their medical device, and the hospital agrees to buy the device they have, thereby securing the father and son at least a bit of money to get by. The following day, Chris heads to the internship to learn about the trade. During a lunch break, Chris meets and greets Mr. Frome in the street. However, their conversation has to be cut short because Chris spots the device he left behind during his earlier escape from the taxi driver. Chris then chases after the guy carrying the device but fails because he gets hit by a car. While he can stand, Chris finds out that he has lost his shoe, so he returns to the program with a missing shoe. Afterwards, the film shows various scenes where Chris is ordered around all the time to buy this and that. In the next scene, Chris seems to have no success with the names on his sheets. He then decides to immediately jump to the company's CEO in hopes that something might happen with that. Luckily, he gets an opportunity to have a meeting with the CEO. As he is running out of the building, his internship boss, Mr. Farkesh, unluckily asks him to park his car somewhere. Because of this, Chris misses the meeting. That night, while eating at a diner, Chris tells his son to assist him tomorrow on a trip. He only convinces him to come when he tells his son that they might possibly go to a football game. The following morning, Chris goes to the house of the CEO he called earlier, Mr. Ribbon. He then thanked Mr. Ribbon for the opportunity yesterday, although he missed it. Mr. Ribbon then invites the father and son to come with them because Chris tells him they are going to the football game. Seeing this as an opportunity, Chris and Christopher go with Mr. Ribbon and his son. During the game, Mr. Ribbon tells him that while he likes Chris, there is no chance that he's going to accept his offer. The upside of this is that Chris gets to talk with Mr. Ribbon and his businessman friends. While things seem to go great, all of this changes when, on a particular day, the IRS takes some money from Chris' bank account as payment for his unpaid taxes. Because of this, he is now broke. To have a bit of money, Chris asks his friend for the money he owes him. However, his friend thought that it's already paid and they drove the father and son to the motel. Chris becomes frustrated with this, prompting his friend to close the door on him. Later that day, Chris sees and finally retrieves the device that he has left earlier. They then immediately head from place to sell the device, only to find out it's broken. While the hospital will still pay for it when it gets fixed, Chris feels distressed. That night, they get home to the motel to find their things outside their room. Chris attempts to open the door, but the lock has changed. With no other options, Chris and his son have to move again despite being tired. They end up in a train station, where Christopher notes that the device his father is holding isn't a time machine. Chris then tells his son that it is. After pressing its button, Chris acts out that they are transported back to the time of dinosaurs, and Christopher acts out that they are transported back to the time of dinosaurs, and Christopher happily goes with this imagination. They then move to the bathroom, where the father and son stay for the night. While his son is asleep, Chris quietly cries at this low light of his life. In the next scene, Chris and his son go to a homeless shelter but get rejected because only women and children are allowed. They then head to another homeless shelter, where they almost get cut off because the rooms are already full. Fortunately, they get their room after the security learns that the one in front of them cheated on his line. Inside the homeless shelter, Chris attempts to fix the device. In the other scene, Chris narrates that he learns how to finish his conversation with clients because he and his son have to get in line early to the homeless shelter. The scenes then jump to Chris and his son attending a mass inside the homeless shelter and Chris studying tomorrow's internship exam. The following day, Chris manages to finish his exam quickly. While going out, Mr. Frome, who just got out of a taxi, asks Chris to lend him some money. Despite only having a limited amount, Chris still lends him $5. To earn money, Chris donates blood. He then uses the money to buy a part of the device he's fixing. At the homeless shelter, Christopher asks his father if Linda left them because of him. Chris reassures him that he has nothing to do with her leaving them. After his son tells him that he's a good father, Chris then successfully fixes the device. The following day, he manages to sell the device, earning them just enough money to sleep in a hotel. Afterwards, the father and son go to the beach to get away from the city's cruel atmosphere. In the next scene, inside the bathroom, Jay congratulates Chris on his final day for securing many clients. Afterwards, Chris gets called by Mr. Fakesh. He leads Chris to Mr. Frome, who notices that Chris is wearing a new shirt. Chris tells him that it's because he's on his last day as an intern, and Mr. Frome responds by saying that he wishes he would still wear it tomorrow, informing him that he got the full-time job. Chris, struggling to hold back tears, thanks the panel, and Mr. Frome returns the $5 he borrowed from him. Chris then goes outside the building, narrating that this part of his life is called happiness. He then heads straight to his son in the daycare and hugs him tight. The film reveals that Chris manages to establish his investment firm. The film then ends with Chris and his son walking somewhere while joking around, with the real Chris Gardner passing by them. The epilogue reveals that Chris has secured a multi-million-dollar deal. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more videos like this to help the channel out. Have a nice day.